They laughed at him before noon. By sunset, not a single man in that room could meet his eyes. The dust came in first, drifting through the open saloon doors in thin, sunlit ribbons, settling on boots, on tables, on the quiet stranger who hadn't asked for anything except a glass of water. He stood near the far end of the bar, hat low, coat worn for miles that didn't leave tracks worth following, and silence wrapped around him like it belonged there. Someone snorted. Then another. It didn't take long. In a town like Dustfall Creek, silence was an invitation, and a man who didn't defend himself was a story waiting to be written by someone else. "You lost, Drifter?" A voice called out, slow and easy, the kind that leaned on words like elbows on a bar. The man didn't answer. He placed 2 coins on the counter, exact change, clean, deliberate, and waited. The bartender glanced at the coins, then at the man, then pushed them back with a single finger like he was brushing away dust. "We serve folks with names," he said. A few men chuckled. The stranger nodded once, as if that settled something only he understood, and picked up the coins without complaint. The room took that as permission. Boots shifted. Chairs creaked. A man with a bright vest and a louder grin stepped closer, close enough to smell the trail on the stranger. Sun, leather, and something colder, like river water in winter. "Name's Cole Brannigan," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "You'll want to remember it." The stranger looked at him then, just a flicker, not a challenge, not even curiosity. Just recognition that a sound had been made. "Don't think he heard you," someone called from a table. Laughter rolled, easy and mean. Cole leaned in, 2 fingers pressing lightly against the stranger's shoulder, not hard, just enough to turn him an inch off balance. The man moved with it, steady, like a post set deep in dry ground.
"No anger, no Jerry."
Cole's grin widened. "Tell you what," he said, reaching for a rag on the bar, tossing it at the man's chest. "Since you ain't got a name, you can earn one. Wipe the dust off my boots." The rag hit and fell. The room quieted just a touch, the way a room does when it senses a line might be crossed, even if no one plans to stop it. The stranger looked down at the rag, then at Cole's boots, scuffed from use, but polished enough to demand attention. A woman behind the bar froze, a glass in her hand, eyes moving from one face to the other. The stranger bent, slow, unhurried, picked up the rag, and knelt. The sound that followed wasn't loud, just cloth against leather, but it filled the room in a way laughter never could. He worked carefully, like the task mattered, like there was a right way to do even this. A few men shifted, uneasy now, though they couldn't say why. Cole laughed again, louder, to cover it. "That's right," he said. "Everyone's got a place." The stranger finished, stood, folded the rag, and set it back on the bar as if returning something borrowed. He didn't look at Cole. He didn't look at anyone. He reached for a small ledger near the register, turned it toward him, and wrote a name with a steady hand. E. Crow. The bartender glanced at it, frowned, then looked away as if the letters might look back. Outside, somewhere down the street, a set of hooves slowed. Inside, the stranger rested his palm lightly on the bar, breathing once, quiet and even, as the dust kept drifting in and the room, for reasons none of them could name, began to feel smaller. The name sat there in wet ink longer than it should have, as if the paper itself needed time to decide whether to accept it, and the bartender kept his eyes on anything but those letters, polishing the same glass over and over while the room tried to remember how to breathe without making a sound, and Cole Brannigan shifted his weight like a man who suddenly was not sure where to stand, his grin still there but thinner now, stretched across a face that had just realized it might have missed something important, and the stranger stepped back from the bar with the same quiet control he had shown from the start, neither proud nor ashamed, just finished, like a task completed on a long road where no one was watching except the dust and the sky, and somewhere outside a horse came to a stop, hooves settling into the hard ground with a slow, measured rhythm that did not belong to panic or hurry but to purpose, and a few heads turned toward the door without meaning to, drawn by something they could not quite name. While inside, Cole tried to pull the room back under his voice. "You think writing a letter makes you someone?" he said, Louder now, looking around for support, and a couple of men nodded because nodding was easier than thinking, but their eyes kept drifting back to the ledger, to the clean lines of that name, E. Crow, written like it had been. Written 1,000 times before on better paper in quieter places, and the woman behind the bar set the glass down a little too carefully, her fingers lingering on the rim as if steadying herself, watching the stranger not with fear but with a question she did not yet have words for, and the stranger rested his hand lightly on the counter again, not claiming space, just touching it, like a man who knew the difference between owning a thing and borrowing it, and his gaze moved once across the room. Not lingering on any one face, but seeing enough, measuring something that had nothing to do with size or numbers, and when his eyes passed over Cole there was no anger there, only a kind of patience that made the air feel heavier, and Cole felt it even if he could not explain it. So he laughed again, sharper this time, and took a step closer. "You going to say something, or are you just passing through like smoke?" he asked, and the stranger finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying. Without effort, "Just passing through," he said, and it should have ended there. It should have been nothing, just another man with no past and no future in a place that did not keep track, but the sound of boots outside grew clearer, more than one set now, and the door shifted on its hinges before anyone touched it, a draft of cooler air sliding across the floor, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and iron and authority that did not need to announce itself, and the bartender's hand stilled on the glass. The woman straightened without thinking, and even Cole turned his head, irritation giving way to something closer to caution, because men who rode like that did not come in for a drink, and the stranger did not turn at all, not yet. He simply stood where he was, hat low, shoulders relaxed, as if he had been expecting this moment from the first step he took into Dustfall Creek, and the name in the ledger seemed to darken as the ink settled fully into the paper, no longer fresh, no longer uncertain, just there, waiting for someone brave enough to read it out loud. The door opened without a sound, yet every man in the room felt it like a shift in weather, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will pass or stay, and Sheriff Thomas Hale stepped inside with a kind of presence that did not need to be loud to be noticed, his hat low but not hiding his face, his coat carrying the dust of miles and decisions, and behind him 2 deputies paused just inside the frame, not reaching for anything, not speaking, just there, and that was enough. The room straightened itself without being told, chairs found their legs, boots settled flat, and even the laughter that had filled the air moments before seemed to retreat into corners where it did not belong, and Cole Brannigan cleared his throat, forcing a smile that felt thinner now. "Sheriff," he said, nodding like he owned the greeting, "just passing time," and Hale did not answer him. Not yet, his eyes moving across the room with slow certainty, taking in faces, hands, the position of bodies, the distance between men, the small details that told larger truths, and then his gaze found the stranger at the bar, and it stopped, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with recognition that settled deep and quiet, like a memory that had been waiting for the right moment to return, and the stranger did not move, did not turn, did not reach for anything. He simply stood as he had stood since he arrived, steady, unclaimed, and the sheriff took one step forward, then another, boots sounding against the wood in a rhythm that carried authority without force, and the deputies remained where they were, watching, learning from the silence, more than any order could teach, and the bartender set the glass down completely now, his hands empty, his eyes flicking between the sheriff and the name in the ledger, as if the two might connect in a way he was not ready to understand, and Cole shifted again, the smile fading into something closer to irritation. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, louder than necessary, trying to reclaim the room with sound alone, but Hale still did not look at him, not yet, his attention fixed on the man at the bar, and for a moment nothing happened. No one spoke. The dust hung in the air like it was listening. And then the sheriff reached up slowly and removed his hat. A simple gesture, practiced, respectful, but here, in this room, at this moment, it carried a weight no one could measure, and a few men blinked, confused by it, because a sheriff did not remove his hat for just anyone, not in a place like this, not in front of men who had spent the last 10 minutes deciding who mattered and who did not, and the stranger finally turned, just enough to meet the sheriff's eyes. And there was something in that look, something quiet and finished, like two men acknowledging a road already walked, and Hale's voice, when it came, was calm, even, unmistakably clear. "Did not expect to see you back this way," he said, and the room leaned in without meaning to, every ear catching the tone more than the words, and Cole's expression tightened, a small crack forming where certainty had been, and the sheriff held the hat at his side for a second longer than needed before adding, softer now but no less certain, "Sir." And the word landed in the room like a truth no one had prepared for, and no one laughed, not anymore. The word did not echo, yet it lingered, settling into the wood, the glass, the bones of every man standing there, and Cole Brannigan felt it first not in his ears, but in his chest, a quiet shift he could not push away no matter how hard he tried to hold his ground, because a sheriff did not speak like that unless there was reason, and reason was something men like Cole preferred to avoid when it turned against them, and the stranger, Elias Crow, let the silence breathe for a moment before he gave it anything back, his eyes steady on Hale, not defiant, not submissive, just equal in a way that made the room feel unfamiliar, and when he spoke it was almost gentle. "It has been a while," he said, and that was all, no explanation, no claim, just a statement that carried years without naming them, and Hale nodded once, slow, as if confirming something already known. "Long enough," the sheriff replied, his voice carrying a weight that belonged to roads no one else in that room had walked, and behind him one of the deputies shifted slightly, glancing between the two men with a flicker of realization beginning to form, like a story he had heard but never believed until now, and the bartender swallowed, his gaze pulled back to the ledger, to the name written there, E. Crow, and this time he did not look away quickly. This time he read it, truly read it, and something in his expression changed, a small tightening around the eyes, a quiet understanding that arrived too late to be useful, and Cole forced a laugh again, but it came out uneven. "Sir," he said, repeating the word like it did not belong, like it could be dismissed if said out loud enough. "You calling him that?" And now Hale finally turned his head, slowly, deliberately, meeting Cole's eyes with a calm that did not rise or fall. "That is correct," he said, simple, final, and Cole's mouth opened then closed, because there were questions he could ask but none that would help him, and the room shifted again. Men who had leaned forward now leaned back, distance forming where there had been confidence, and Elias reached for his coins once more, placing them on the counter again, same two pieces, same quiet intent, and the bartender did not push them away this time, his hand hovering for a second before taking them, nodding once without speaking, and the woman behind the bar moved to fill a glass without being asked, setting it down gently in front of Elias like an apology she could not say out loud, and he inclined his head slightly in thanks, not making more of it than it was, and Hale stepped closer to the bar, resting his hand on the worn wood. "We have a situation outside town," he said, not loudly, but the room heard it anyway. "Thought you might want to hear it before anyone else," and Elias looked at the glass, then at the sheriff, weighing something that did not show on his face, and for a moment it seemed like he might refuse. Like he might let the town keep its problems and walk back out into the dust where names did not matter, but then he lifted the glass, took a slow drink, and set it down again. "I am listening," he said, and that was enough to draw every eye back to him, not with mockery now, not with ease, but with the quiet tension of men realizing they had spoken too soon, acted too quickly, judged without understanding, and the dust kept drifting through the door, unchanged, uncaring, as if it had seen this happen before and would see it again. The room did not move, yet everything inside it had shifted, like a line had been drawn that no one remembered crossing, and Sheriff Hale kept his voice low, not for secrecy, but because it did not need to be raised. "North Ridge," he said, eyes still on Elias. "About 12 miles out, near the dry creek that bends east, there is a small settlement, 3 families, nothing more. They have been losing supplies, livestock going missing, tools left broken. No sign of who or why, just pieces of a story that do not line up," and Elias listened without interrupting, his hand resting near the glass but not touching it, his posture unchanged. though something behind his eyes had begun to measure distances, times, possibilities, and Hale continued. I sent 2 men to look into it yesterday. They came back with nothing except the feeling that someone wanted them to find nothing, and that kind of quiet is rarely empty. And one of the deputies shifted again, this time more certain, glancing at Elias with a mix of respect and something closer to curiosity, as if trying to place him within the stories he had heard in fragments over years. Stories about a man who did not need a badge to be obeyed, who did not need a title to be known, and the bartender leaned slightly closer without realizing it, his earlier dismissal now replaced with careful attention, while Cole stood where he was, no longer the center of anything, his hands uncertain at his sides, eyes flicking between Hale and Elias, searching for a foothold that had already slipped away, and Elias finally spoke. "And you think I should take a look?" he said, not as a question but as a recognition of what was being asked, and Hale gave a small nod. "I think you would see what my men did not," he replied, and there was no flattery in it, only fact, and Elias let that sit for a moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the open door where the light had shifted slightly. Afternoon stretching toward evening, time moving whether men chose to act or not, and the woman behind the bar stepped back, giving space without being told, as if instinct had finally caught up with understanding, and Elias reached into his coat, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to draw out a small, worn object, something metal that caught the light for a second before he turned it in his fingers, a badge, old but kept, its edges softened by years rather than neglect, and he did not show it to the room, not fully, just enough for Hale to see, for confirmation rather than display, and Hale's eyes flicked to it and back, the slightest acknowledgement passing between them, and Elias slipped it away again, as if it had never been there, because it was not meant for the room, not for Cole, not for the men who had laughed, but for a decision already made, and he picked up the glass once more, finished what remained, and set it down with quiet finality. "I will ride out before sunset," he said, and the words settled into the space with a different kind of weight than before, not surprise now, but expectation, and Hale inclined his head. "I will have a horse ready," he said, turning slightly toward the door, already moving into action, and Elias reached for his hat, adjusting it with a small, practiced motion, then stepped away from the bar, passing Cole without looking at him, without a word, and that silence said more than anything else could have, because it left nothing to argue with, nothing to push against, only the memory of what had been said and done, and Cole stood there, feeling it settle, understanding in a way he had not expected that some men did not need to prove anything at all, and the dust outside lifted again as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of distance and whatever waited 12 miles north, where quiet things were already moving. The light outside had softened into that late afternoon glow that made everything look quieter than it really was, and Elias stepped out onto the wooden porch without looking back, the door closing behind him with a muted sound that seemed to seal the room, and everything inside it in a different time, and the air carried the dry scent of dust and sun-warmed leather, the kind that clung to a man's coat long after he left a place behind. And tied to the hitching rail was a dark bay horse, steady-eyed, well-kept, not flashy, but built for distance rather than show, and Elias paused beside it, running a hand along its neck once, not as a greeting but as a habit, something practiced over years where trust was earned in quiet gestures, and Sheriff Hale stepped out a moment later, the deputies remaining inside, their voices low now, uncertain, as if the world they thought they understood had shifted just enough to leave them careful with their words, and Hale stopped a few feet away, giving Elias the space of a man who did not need to stand close to be heard. "Saddle is fresh. Water skin is full. You should make the ridge before dark if you keep a steady pace," he said, and Elias nodded once, checking the cinch without hurry, his movements economical, each one done for a reason, not for show, and the town stretched out around them. Quiet in that way places get when something important has just happened but no one wants to speak of it yet. Curtains shifting behind windows, silhouettes pausing in doorways, eyes following without being seen, and from inside the saloon, Cole Brannigan stood just within the shadow of the doorway, watching, not stepping out, not calling after him, because there was nothing left to say that would not make things worse, and Elias mounted the horse in one smooth motion, settling into the saddle like it belonged to him without needing to prove it, and Hale looked up at him, his expression steady, but carrying something unspoken. "There is one more thing," the sheriff said, and Elias waited, not asking, and Hale continued, "Whoever is out there, they are not taking much, just enough to be noticed, like they want to be seen without being caught. That is not hunger, that is a message," and Elias considered that, his gaze drifting north where the land rose in slow, dry lines toward the ridge, where shadows would stretch long before the sun gave up the sky. "Messages are meant for someone," he said quietly, and Hale gave a small nod. "That is what concerns me." And the wind shifted again, carrying a faint chill from the direction Elias would ride, and he adjusted his hat, not pulling it lower, just setting it right, then gathered the reins with a calm grip. "Keep the town quiet," he said, not as an order but as a suggestion that carried weight, and Hale understood it as both. "I will," he replied, stepping back, and Elias gave the horse a gentle nudge, the animal moving forward into the street with a steady, unhurried gait, not rushing, not hesitating, just going, and as he passed the edge of the town, the buildings thinning into open land, the noise of Dustfall Creek faded behind him, replaced by the sound of hooves against packed earth, measured, certain, and ahead, the North Ridge waited, 12 miles of open ground where answers did not come easily and silence often meant more than words ever could, and the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like questions across the land, and Elias rode into them without looking back. The land opened wide the moment the last building of Dustfall Creek disappeared behind him, and the world became what it had always been beyond town lines, quiet, patient, and honest in a way men rarely were, and Elias rode at a steady pace, not pushing the horse, not slowing it either, letting the rhythm of hooves against hard ground settle into something that matched his breathing, his thoughts moving just as measured, just as deliberate. And the sun leaned low in the sky now, stretching shadows long across the dry earth, turning every rock, every scrub bush into something that could hide meaning if a man knew how to look, and Elias knew how to look, not for what was obvious, but for what did not belong, the small things that felt out of place in a land that had its own rules long before men tried to write their own over it. And about 5 miles out, he slowed the horse near a shallow dip in the ground where the wind had shifted the dust differently, and he dismounted without a sound, crouching low, fingers brushing the surface lightly, not searching, just confirming, and there it was, a pattern broken, not by force, not by carelessness, but by intention, tracks that came and went without urgency, spaced evenly, almost polite in the way they touched the ground, as if whoever made them did not want to disturb more than necessary, and Elias followed them with his eyes first, then stood, leading the horse on foot for a stretch, letting the animal move quieter, the leather creaking softly with each step, and the air carried something faint now, not smoke, not exactly, but the memory of it, like a fire that had been there long enough to matter, but not long enough to be seen, and he paused again, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it, because out here, silence could tell more truth than noise ever could, and after a moment he mounted again, turning slightly east where the dry creek bent as Hale had described, and the land dipped there, just enough to hold shadows even before the sun fully set, and as he crested the small rise above it, he saw them, 3 cabins spaced unevenly, worn but standing, smoke curling thin from one chimney, the other still, and no movement in the open, no figures crossing between buildings, nothing that suggested panic or ease, just a stillness that felt placed there, like part of the message Hale had spoken of, and Elias guided the horse down slowly, not riding straight in, not announcing himself, instead circling wide, keeping distance, observing from angles that gave him more than one view, and near the edge of the settlement he noticed it again, the same careful disturbance, supplies moved but not taken entirely, tools left where they could be found but not used, doors closed but not secured, and it was not disorder, not chaos, it was arrangement, deliberate and controlled, and that told him something important. Whoever was here was not desperate, not careless, they were patient, and patience was more dangerous than hunger. And as the last light of the sun dipped below the ridge, casting the land into a softer gray, Elias finally guided the horse closer, not fast, not slow, just enough to be seen by anyone who might be watching. And as he approached the nearest cabin, the door opened before he reached it, a man stepping out, older, worn by years but steady, his eyes meeting Elias with caution first, then something else, something closer to recognition of a different kind, not of the man, but of what he represented. And Elias stopped a few feet away, his posture easy, his voice calm. "Evening," he said, and the man nodded once, glancing briefly toward the other cabins before answering. "You came alone," and Elias did not smile, did not explain, he simply replied, "That is enough," and the wind moved through the dry creek behind them, carrying with it the quiet sense that whatever message had been left here was about to be understood. The man at the cabin door did not move aside immediately, and that pause carried more meaning than any question could have, his eyes studying Elias not with suspicion alone but with a quiet calculation of someone who had already seen enough to know when something did not fit. And Elias remained where he was, one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, not reaching, not pressing, simply waiting in that way that turned time into something slower, something deliberate, and the wind moved again. Through the dry creek, carrying a faint rustle from somewhere beyond the line of cabins, a sound too controlled to be random, too careful to be ignored, and the older man finally spoke, his voice low. "They do not take what they need, they take what they want us to notice." And Elias nodded once, because that matched what he had already seen, the arrangement, the intention behind each small absence, and the man stepped aside then, not as an invitation but as a recognition that the moment had already chosen its direction, and Elias dismounted, tying the reins loosely to a worn post, the horse settling without fuss, ears turning slightly toward the darkening ridge, sensing what men could not yet name. And as Elias stepped closer to the cabin, the door across the clearing opened just enough for another figure to appear, a woman this time, her posture guarded but not afraid, her gaze fixed on Elias with the same question the first man had held, and behind her, shadows moved in careful patterns, not hiding, not revealing, just present, and Elias took it all in without turning his head, his awareness stretching across the space like a line drawn in dust, and he spoke again, his voice carrying just enough to reach both cabins. "You have been left a message," he said, and the older man's jaw tightened slightly, not in disagreement but in confirmation. "We thought so," he replied, "but we do not know what it says." And Elias let his eyes drift briefly toward the edge of the clearing, where the ground showed the same careful disturbances he had followed, the same deliberate spacing, and he stepped toward it, crouching once more, fingers brushing the earth, tracing the pattern not as tracks, but as intention. And there, just beyond where most would stop looking, he found it, a small object pressed lightly into the dirt, not hidden, not displayed, something meant to be overlooked by anyone who did not know to search differently, and he lifted it between his fingers, a simple piece of metal, worn but marked, and for a moment his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes settled into place, like the final piece of a puzzle that had been waiting without urgency, and he stood, turning the object slightly so the fading light caught its edge, and the older man stepped closer, cautious. "What is it?" he asked, and Elias looked at him, then at the woman across the clearing, then back to the object, and his voice when it came was quieter than before but heavier. "It is not a threat," he said, "it is a warning," and the words seemed to shift the air, not into fear, but into something sharper, more focused. And the woman stepped fully into the doorway now, her voice steady. "From who?" she asked, and Elias held the object a moment longer before closing his hand around it, not hiding it, just holding it where it belonged. "From someone who knows this land well enough to speak without being seen," he said, and he glanced once more toward the ridge, where the last light had almost faded, leaving the land in that quiet gray where shapes blurred and certainty thinned, and he added, "Not to them alone but to the space itself, and someone who expects an answer." And the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the weight of that expectation across the clearing as the night settled in around them. The night settled slowly over the ridge, not all at once but in layers, the last line of sunlight fading behind the hills while the sky turned the color of worn steel, and Elias stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the small piece of metal still resting in his palm, its weight light but certain, the kind of weight that did not belong to the object itself, but to the meaning it carried. And the older man watched him without speaking now, no longer asking questions, because something in Elias's stillness had already begun to answer them, and across the clearing the woman stepped down from the doorway, her footsteps quiet against the dirt as she came closer, drawn not by fear but by the need to understand what had been left behind for them, and Elias finally closed his hand around the object, not hiding it, just ending its moment in the light, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, as if the land itself had settled into it. "They are not testing your strength," he said, his gaze moving slowly across the cabins, the scattered tools, the careful gaps where things had been moved but not taken. "They are testing your reaction," and the older man frowned slightly, the lines on his face deepening with thought rather than confusion. "Reaction to what?" he asked, and Elias looked back toward the ridge, toward the path the tracks had followed and then disappeared. "To whether you will call for help or stand still," he said, and the words carried something final in them, something that did not invite argument, and the woman folded her arms lightly, not in defense but in consideration. "And what happens if we do neither?" she asked, and Elias met her eyes, not sharply, not softly, just honestly. "Then the message ends here," he replied, and for a moment the three of them stood in that quiet, the wind moving through the dry creek behind them, the night pressing closer but not closing in, and then Elias stepped back, turning toward his horse, the decision already made in the way he moved, and the older man watched him go, something like understanding settling into his expression, not relief, not yet, but the beginning of it. "You are leaving," he said, not as a question. And Elias paused at the saddle, his hand resting against the leather for a second before he answered. "It is not my message to answer," he said, and there was no distance in the words, no avoidance, just truth placed where it belonged, and he mounted with the same quiet ease as before, the horse shifting beneath him, ready, and the woman looked at him once more, her voice softer now. "Will they come back?" she asked, and Elias adjusted his hat slightly, his eyes moving once more across the clearing, taking in every detail as if setting it in memory. "Only if you answer them," he said, and then he turned the horse, not sharply, not slowly, just enough to face the open land again, and the older man stepped forward a fraction, as if to say something more, but stopped, because there was nothing left that needed to be said, and Elias gave a small nod, not to one of them, but to both, to the place, to the moment, and then he rode out, the sound of hooves steady against the ground, fading as distance took him, and the ridge remained, quiet as it had been before, holding its secrets without urgency, and back in Dustfall Creek, long after the night had settled, the saloon stood a little quieter than it had that afternoon, the ledger still open on the counter, the name written there no longer fresh but no less sharp, and no one laughed when they passed it, not anymore, because some things did not need to be explained, they only needed to be seen once and remembered, and somewhere beyond the reach of the town, beyond the reach of names and stories, Elias Crow rode on, not carrying justice with him, not leaving it behind, but moving through it the only way a man could out here, without noise, without claim, and without ever needing to say who he was again.